Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ensuring Safety in Virtual Space, Strategies for Risk Threat Assessment and Identifying Abuse During Distance Learning. This session is with our speaker, Dr. Erica Ollinger. I am Trisha Goga, and I'm your host for this session. A few friendly reminders during the session. Please make sure your microphone is turned off so that it doesn't disrupt the session. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or save them until the end during the Q&A session. Please complete the session feedback form on the Whova app or website in your agenda, and you will receive a conference survey on March 11th. Thank you so much for attending and enjoy the session.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, on this nice spring day. And thank you, Trisha, so much for setting up our virtual learning expectations. And I just want to thank you all for joining me today on ensuring safety in virtual space. And I'm Dr. Erica Ollinger. I'm a nationally certified school psychologist, a board certified behavior analyst, and a licensed psychologist here in Oklahoma. And if you want to know more about me, please feel free to read on the bio, but I'm going to skip that for now because I'd rather just jump into the good stuff. So all I'll say by way of introduction is that I'm currently a crisis team school psychologist with the State Department of Education, and I help lead and manage the crisis team there. And crisis management is my jam. So I'm always so excited to talk about it and so thankful that we are here to talk about safety in virtual space. While you take a peek at these learning objectives, I do just want to say initially that I know we're all hopeful that COVID-19 is becoming more managed, that we have the vaccine now, that other mitigation measures we hope are paying off, and that very soon we shouldn't have the majority of our students in full-time distance learning or virtual learning spaces. I know many schools this week are reopening. Some schools never went to a full virtual schedule to begin with. So while I recognize that, I think we shouldn't let that make us complacent. And I think one of the opportunities that came from COVID-19 and the huge shifts in education is that we did kind of catch up in some ways in technology. And so I think it's worth noting that virtual learning in one form or another is likely here to stay, at least in some contexts and for some students. So again, hopefully, throughout the rest of this school year and into the fall, we'll shift back to more in-person and instruction that looks more like what we're traditionally used to. But I truly believe that there's going to be at least some subsets of students who will remain in virtual learning spaces. And sometimes when schools might utilize virtual learning platforms as part of their day or as part of their procedures. So for example, I'm a little worried that the traditional snow day has gone by the wayside and schools in the future may elect instead to shift to virtual learning. I mean, we kind of have the hang of it now. For the record, Erica Ollinger is not advocating for taking away snow days. I just want to go down in history as having said that. But I am saying that I think we will be making more and more use of virtual space, even if it isn't on the level we've seen before. And so that's why I think it's important for us to talk about issues of safety and really be thinking with our eye towards how can we accommodate students in virtual spaces for the rest of this year through the pandemic, certainly, but also moving forward. So that's some of the issues I hope to talk about and touch on today. I'll also say I have a ton of material, and please forgive me if I do choose throughout to skip slides or if I'm speaking faster than I usually want to. There's just so much and not enough time. The good news is we're being recorded, so you can come back and listen to pieces if you feel like it. And I tried to provide additional resources. And I made the PowerPoint, I erred on the side of I'm going to give you more information, so at least you have it rather than less, but please forgive me if that doesn't match with some of your preferred presentation and participation styles. And please engage in dialogue. And I can't see the chat box, but Trisha is going to help me moderate that. Engage in dialogue, ask questions. If we don't get to them during the session, I can be sure and try to follow up, particularly if you have a question and you leave some contact information for me. Okay, by way of quick disclaimer, and I do have two screens if my eyes go this way, I'm utilizing two screens, but as a quick disclaimer, what I'm going to talk about today should in no way be taken for or replace good, comprehensive, structured training in some of the important processes we're going to be talking about today. So as school counselors or school mental health providers, I hope that you've had training in procedures such as suicide risk assessment or behavioral threat assessment and management and in mandatory reporting. And if you haven't, I would certainly encourage you to make sure that you have comprehensive training and ideally, some supervised or mentored experience in those processes, because those are difficult and heavy. And I can't do that for you in the 50 minutes that we have. What I'm hoping to do is really to take those of us who are seasoned in these procedures and really challenge us to think about what needs to change and what needs to be added, and how do some of our traditional ways of viewing these procedures for safety really need to be reflective of students in virtual space or distance learning. And for those that are just beginning the work, also to just have a mind for, like many things with the pandemic, this is new for some of us, and reconceptualizing some of these behaviors we've been doing for years and these procedures we've engaged in and trained on might have to change. So that's my hope, is to complement the comprehensive training and experience that I think you would have as a mental health professional. Okay, so jumping into the challenges, I don't need to spend a ton of time on this. Many of you are in the buildings and you can tell me without doubt that there's challenges with virtual learning and with distance education. And, we're seeing it all over the place. The different types of challenges that have been posed for us. So in addition to the academic challenges, which are certainly relevant, and the technology challenges, yes, all relevant and all important for education, I just tried to list here kind of a bulleted list of challenges we would think of as those providing mental health supports and safety supports and crisis supports, and things that have challenged our work as mental health and behavioral health providers. So of course, things like if we can't physically see and interact and speak with students, that inhibits our traditional ways of building relationships with students and our staff for that matter. A lot of this content, of course, would also apply to the staff that we support in our buildings. When we're not physically with students and staff, it's more difficult to monitor behavior. Most of us are used to keeping an eye on students who may be at risk, students that we're working with, and having physical access and physical interaction as part of our monitoring procedures. And we know that if we can't see students in person, or if we only see them through the screen, or even worse, if they're not logging on or not turning on their cameras, that makes it difficult for us to do our jobs in the same way as we did previously. Isolation, of course, not just for students. We keep our students top of mind, but think about our own isolation as professionals. This conference has been amazing and lovely, and it is fun to just see people across the state over the screen. But my guess is most of us would prefer to be in the room together, sharing ideas, talking, consulting, bouncing cases off of one another, and having that interaction. And so just by virtue of us being somewhat isolated from one another in our buildings or as a larger mental health community, I think has impacts clearly on our practice. Challenges in terms of keeping student engaged, especially in work that they might not see as being required, since the emphasis potentially has been on academics and making sure those gaps don't increase. And then we know that this is a generalization, but there's potential for students that we considered at risk pre-pandemic to really be at increased risk now. So students who already needed specialized services or needed social, emotional, or mental health supports, that might be exacerbated now. We know that the pandemic has highlighted disparities and inequities in terms of, students who might be in high poverty or in very rural, that's a hard word for me, rural, small town America, and other just societal factors and disparities that have been highlighted that might put students that we as mental health folks work with at even greater risk or in need of support. And of course, we're already making adjustments to our typical ways of delivering social emotional learning and support, mental health resources. And so we're just kind of in a shift in terms of our typical roles have changed and how we provide our services. Okay, Erica, and if that last slide wasn't depressing enough, let's add some more kind of big deal issues and challenges that we're facing that we just need to be mindful of and that are certainly impacting the safety of our students. And so lots of evidence to show that there's more predatory behavior, more online predators, and unfortunately going for sometimes younger and younger students. Cyberbullying, I'll probably say it 100 times a day because I think that is a place in our field that we really need to be mindful and proactive, because that's kind of our next challenge in terms of keeping our schools and students safe. And then issues like sexting, like, can we stop it with the nudes already? But we know like that's something virtually that is a threat to student and staff safety that we need to be mindful of. And even things like, raise your hand if especially at the beginning, you weren't Zoom bombed at least once, and so there is specific behavior that takes place online from hackers and other folks who would pose a threat and want to do harm to our students in schools. So all of these are additional challenges to add to our plate and things to be mindful of. So what does that mean for us as the school counselors, the school psychologists, the mental health providers? What it means, of course, the research is still indicating, and I think there's reason to believe that in general, we're going to see a greater need for students and staff needing that social emotional learning. They're going to need additional mental health supports because of the pandemic, because of the isolation and other factors resultant from the pandemic, but other world events too that seem to just have kind of potentially stacked on top of one another. So the civil unrest, the racism, all of those types of things students are facing in addition to the pandemic. So here's the thing. In our crisis world, at least at the crisis team at the State Department, we like to view crisis through the lens of crisis is danger, and it's challenge, and it's hard, and it's heartbreaking at times. But crisis is also an opportunity, and it gives us so many opportunities to learn and to grow and to improve. So when we think about having this huge shift to distance learning, on the one hand, mental health folks had a victory because finally people are like, oh, maybe we should do some social emotional stuff at school. Maybe we should provide mental health to students, right? So it's a victory. And that, one of the things we've been advocating for our entire careers is finally kind of coming to the forefront. People are paying attention. There's going to be legislation and drive and advocacy for us to do the job we've been wanting to do for a very long time. But that means we have to put our money where our mouth is, right? Like now it's time for us to show up with those supports and with those SCL initiatives and show folks that it's beneficial and that they were right, that this is what students need. So what that means for us is we have to do better in our skills and we have to increase our own competencies. Again, we might have to adapt procedures or protocols or things we've been engaged with for years in order to truly meet staff and student needs. So specifically today, I'm going to be talking about, we can't do suicide risk assessment the same way virtually that we may have done for years in person. We have to update and be trained and gain competence in what behavioral threat assessment looks like in the virtual space, for example. And we have to be more mindful of what dangerous behavior and what safety concerns look like in our virtual environments. So, it's a heavy lift for us. We have some learning and some growing to do. Even very experienced mental health folks have a heavy lift ahead of us. And that then our change in skills, our change in knowledge will result in a change in the policies, the procedures, the interventions, and all of the supports that we provide to students. So I hope today not to overwhelm you with like this huge task list of things that you have to do. I'm going to compel you. I hope that you think of some things. And if you walk away with just 3 ways that you can improve your practice for safety in virtual space, or 3 ideas to bring back to your teams for consideration, I think that's plenty. In some ways, I'm hoping to open the Pandora's box of compelling ideas and things to think about moving forward the rest of the year, after a deserved break this summer, into the next school year and beyond. So I don't want you to feel like it all has to happen today or feel overwhelmed. I want you to leave with some ideas, and I hope to point you to references and resources that will get you there. That you don't have to start from the bottom up. There is work being done that will support you as you engage in some of these endeavors. Okay, so let's start with the basics and just some basic ideas for what it means to encourage safety in virtual space. And some of these things you may have already been doing in very structured ways or fly by the seat of your pants ways. And so far, either of those is perfectly acceptable. But again, as we move forward, I think some of these things hopefully will become more structured, more procedural, and really be a part of the fabric of what we're doing in schools. So when we train on our prepare curriculum as part of the crisis team, and hold that for till the end, we'll talk more about prepare at the very end today, but the framework of crisis management that I utilize and that we're building the state framework from, we love because it is focused on schools and because it takes into account at least 2 aspects of safety, and that's physical safety, which is critical. We have to have physical structures, we have to have people, we have to have physical safety for our students, absolutely. But the other side of that coin that we know as mental health folks is that's only effective if we also have psychological safety in our schools. If students and faculty feel safe and they feel like they belong and they're a part of our schools. So we always talk about that balance when we're thinking about how to specifically address crises and safety in schools. So this first concept I'm going to talk about is the concept of digital safety. And if you're sorting into that physical or psychological safety side, I kind of sort this into physical safety. That is, we have to make our virtual spaces safe, the same way that we try to make our school buildings safe, with structures and infrastructure and very intentional ideas that encourage physical safety. So what does physical safety mean in the digital world? It means we need to talk to students about things like sharing personal information, why it's important to have an important password and not to share those things, that the internet is forever and we're telling you not to post the nudes because they're on there forever, and then people can see that and here's what they can do with it. So it's important that we talk about the things that are safe to do online and the things that are not safe to do. And for a long time it was that we relied on our district tech folks, and they're like, oh, they are so good, they're going to block all of those nefarious sites and all those naughty sites, and we don't have to worry about it. Or thank goodness the district now adopted an email system that will filter for concerning content, and those are great. But we can't live in a place where we're relying on just those anymore. So I would advocate for creating lessons, creating policy, creating instruction around why this is important. The other piece too is that we've done some of this, I think it's secondary for a while. They may have already had, digital safety policies and lessons, but I myself am the mother of a kindergarten and a first grade student, and I can tell you, we asked them to get online. So my kids, who I might not have personally chosen to be as involved in online places as they are, they're online. So even young students need to know they have a password. my kids have a password to get onto some of their platforms. And so having the discussion about keeping them and our family and our schools safe. Getting students involved in that is critical, I think. For one thing, they have more ownership, and they, just like anything else, they feel more likely to engage if they feel like they have some ownership. Plus, of course, students are the ones that can tell us where they're hanging out, what this app does, what the new app is, what the old app now does. And so in a lot of ways, that keeps us informed and helps us to know what they're doing and where they're going, so we can monitor safety. In the same way, again, I would advocate for curricula and direct instruction in things like predatory behavior, teaching kids, at the building, we teach them what to do if they're in physical danger. Here's what we do when there's a tornado. Here's what we do if you think there's an active shooter. Here's what you do when there's a stranger that you don't know, and how you interact. So we need to be providing the same types of instruction and explicit direction in the digital space. These are things that aren't safe. Here's what we do when it happens. And I'll talk a lot about the instruction is only half of it. The other piece is we have to have effective reporting mechanisms so that students know how to self-advocate for, I'm not feeling safe, or I don't think my friend is safe, or I saw this and I'm worried about it. And so we're going to talk about different reporting mechanisms and having those in place so that if kids are being bullied and they don't feel safe, or they heard another student say something that makes the digital world uncomfortable, that they know what to do and how to report, and that those systems are effective. So switching now kind of to this notion of the psychological safety, we had digital safety, and then there's kind of a different associated class of behaviors and lessons and things I think we could arm students with, them, and that's digital citizenship. And this is where, just like we're working on creating positive school culture and climate that is welcoming for students on our campuses, and where students feel, again, safe and as if they belong on that campus, they need to feel like they belong in our virtual spaces too. And we need to create expectations and behaviors and other pieces that set that up to be a positive place of belonging where they can be. So we do that through digital citizenship. And I know this is work you've likely been engaging in already, but that's the things like, what is the etiquette going to be when we're online? What are the rules that apply globally, whether we're on campus or we're in our virtual spaces? But then paying particular attention to, do we have rules that specifically address the virtual spaces? So things, for example, it could be like no side conversations in the chat box, no taking screenshots without permission, no sharing things that are offensive, etc. And just like any other parts of our code of conduct, we can't prevent these things from happening 100% of the time. But as we know, the more we teach behavior expectations, the more we model them, the more we practice them, the more we explain on a developmental level why they're important, the more success we'll see. The other consideration is that we have to have parents involved in a more intentional sense than previously, because we're asking parents to help us more and to be a part of certainly the virtual school community more. So they need to be receiving that same information. They might need some lessons. They might need to know what to do as well, and what the rules are. And so parent involvement needs to be top of mind as well. Whereas previously, they might have had an honorable mention or be involved somewhat, but they weren't as involved in creating our on-campus policies. Okay, so you guys know these things. Some of these things just create a safe space for people to be and to participate and to learn. And some of these are easy and powerful, and some of them are more difficult. So we know, and we're encouraging our teachers and ourselves to create relationships as much as we can in the online environment. Sometimes very small things are huge in creating a safe space for somebody, particularly if they didn't feel welcome in the first place. So things like making sure we're pronouncing names correctly, or adding pronouns, for example. You'll see on our Zoom today, I listed my pronouns. That's just one example of ways that we can create virtual spaces that feel safe to students who may not otherwise feel safe. I know that virtual backgrounds has the effect of then we can't monitor as closely what's going on with students. However, if it makes them feel more safe to not be embarrassed that they still share a room with little brother, or that they're messy, or if it makes parents feel more comfortable and they're okay with students getting online, teach them how to use backgrounds, right? Just make it a safe place for people to be. I know my mental health folks will be great in instituting those mood and temperature checks in the online environment. I just think about when I was in buildings, I could get up and, once or twice a day, I would frequent those classrooms where I knew I needed to check in. I would certainly at least be putting eyeballs on students, even if I didn't talk to them, just to see how they're doing. I'd check in on my staff. That's harder to do in the virtual space. And so it falls on us, I think, to be creative of how can we for ourselves engage in those check-ins and those temperature checks and those monitoring of students, but also how can we help teachers and other adults interfacing students to do the same thing, and then to know how to access us for support. And then of course things like just take away anything obvious that would lead to online bullying or bias or some of those things, being familiar with our features enough to be able to do that. Again, in order to feel safe on campus, kids need to feel like they have a trusted place to go when they feel like they are in danger. And so this would count for on-campus instruction or virtual instruction. We need to have ways for students to advocate for, I don't feel safe, or I don't think my friend's safe, or I need help. And we need usually more than one way to do that. So not just saying, please tell your teacher in your Google Classroom, or hey, feel free to email the counselor if, but having age appropriate mechanisms that they'll use and that they're comfortable with, and that also work. So it has to be something where there's follow through on the backside, where if I report that I don't feel safe, I feel like somebody's paying attention to that. So there's a lot of different apps and different ways now for cyberbullying, certainly suicide awareness, those types of things that we'll talk about. I also did just want to highlight on this slide, give a shout out to my colleagues at the State Department of Ed in the Safety and Security Office. And one of their projects that just recently got completed is there is a statewide threat line where if you feel safe or someone else feels unsafe, and it can be a student, a parent, a visitor, a teacher, anyone on campus, they can call or text, or I think even get online to report a threat, and then there's follow through with that. And so the appropriate folks will handle that perceived threat. But just knowing that there's a mechanism to report when you don't feel safe is important. And that once you do report that there's some sort of action is clearly important. Okay, I got to get going here. Other ways to make safety, and I know you guys are good at this, is creating spaces for social engagement or communities, not just that's not associated with classroom work or school work. Clearly, that's healthy because it helps kids connect with peers and adults and create relationships. Through the context of our lens today of thinking about assessments, though, and monitoring of concerning behaviors, it allows for another environment where kids might be more likely to let their guard down, be informal, or otherwise engage in behavior that isn't as formal as classroom work can be. So that would just be another reason, besides the clear implications for relationship building, it gives us another space to look at behavior and to monitor kiddos. And the last basic safety tip I would give is just to keep up with technology. So, okay, confession, like I still don't even have a Twitter account. So it's hard. And I'm not saying you have to download every app and know how they all work, but have a pulse or make sure that someone in your school community has a pulse on that. The other piece of technology is we have to be mindful of how technology can help us in our work. We are a face-to-face profession. We are a people profession, a relationships profession. But I think we also have to face the reality that there are tools now and there are things that we need to gain competency in that makes use of technology. And it serves our students best if we stay ahead of that and on top of that in terms of our skills. Okay, moving on, and I know I'm going so fast, but moving on from some of those basic virtual safety ideas, I did want to touch on a couple of procedures that you're going to need to work on and that you're going to be mindful of. And one is, again, the virtual suicide prevention and suicide risk assessment procedures. And the work I'm going to reference in this next section is from the National Association of School Psychologists, of which, of course, I'm an affiliate. I was actually recently appointed to the National NASP School Crisis Response and School Safety Committee. But these are the folks who have been doing the crisis work for a very long time. And I'm sure ASCA and other groups have also been doing the work. So it's not to take away from what others are doing. It's just the procedures I'm most familiar with and that I'm most comfortable with, and knowing that they are empirically based, that they're sound, and that they are comprehensive. It's going to cover your bases, but also digestible for school folks, and something that feels doable. So that's what I'll be referencing. And the first set of materials is related to virtual suicide prevention and intervention, and including that suicide risk assessment. So there's 3 documents that complement one another. One is the kind of the guidance document, the one you would read, is the Comprehensive School Suicide Prevention in a Time of Distance Learning, and it's a guidance document. And they, I think, released it, I want to say, late spring of last year during the pandemic, and they are updating it. In addition to that, the 2 that I think you will find useful and practical are 2 checklists. And the intent would be for you to take your current procedures for suicide prevention, risk assessment, intervention, and take these checklists and kind of do a comparison and find where are our deficiencies, what did we miss, how do we need to update these policies. So I find these checklists to just be helpful as a way to make sure you're incorporating these virtual considerations into your current plans and procedures. I cannot explain them as well, of course, as the authors themselves. So on the resource list that I attached in the resources section for the conference, I do have links to the NASP website. And one of the resources is they have a series called Ask the Experts webinar series. And I know your head just exploded. Like, we don't need more webinars, but having Steve Brock and Rich Lieberman, 2 of the lead authors, lead you through these procedures and talk through them would be so helpful. I don't have time to do that today, and it would be so helpful as you look to update your procedures. So here's a quick glance of just what the overall guidance document looks like and some of the things it includes as considerations. So things like virtual service delivery, telehealth, etc. So leave you to read those. And this is just a screenshot of, again, I think those helpful checklists, one for your prevention efforts, one for your intervention efforts. The next few slides, I promise I cut this down from like my 872 slides to begin with. This is just some of the take-home messages I found helpful from those checklists. And this isn't exhaustive. It's just some things that stood out from me. Again, I would encourage you looking at the entire checklist, but things like, we have to update our policies. Most of our schools likely have board adopted policies or procedures and protocols for how we're addressing suicide prevention and intervention. We've got to update those policies to talk about now what that will look like for distance learning. And again, don't even think necessarily COVID. Think about 2 years down the road where your district now has optional, choices for students to engage in virtual work, for example. So updating policies. Also, we might have to rethink our resource directories. So again, when I was in the schools, I usually was very comfortable in knowing if I needed emergency support, I could call this number for the crisis line, or I could call the police and they would be here in X amount of time. We're not on campus. We're not sitting with the student potentially. So do we have resource that can reach students from across our district? We might be small and the nearest help is far away. We might be big and it's hard to know when they're going to get there, but we need to be thinking about, those emergency procedures and how it would look different if we're providing aid to students at a distance. Another big one is, of course, when we were in buildings, if Mrs. Brown had a student and she was worried that the student was having suicidal ideations, she could call me and I could walk down the hall and pick up the student and we could go to the office or have an intervention in the hallway. Or she could escort the student to me, and we don't have that luxury. So on top of the already heavy platters of teachers, we need to be instrumental in talking to them about online, what are suicide risk factors? What do those look like? And how do we even need to be more mindful with the pandemic and other factors that might increase suicide risk? And in addition to that, we have to give teachers more permission and more capacity to do the hard things that we're used to doing, and tell them, if you see this, you stop and you do call 911, or you stop and you do call the mobile crisis unit, because it's the things that we used to help handle and help navigate when we were within the walls of a campus. And so it's important to arm teachers with information to get students the help that they need. And that should be some part of your prevention efforts. Other things, of course, is, again, I never would, telehealth for mental health services in some capacities has been a thing. Like, there have been people engaged in that work for many years now. Not something I was personally interested in. I'm a people person. I'm a face-to-face person. I'm a go to the people person. But again, I think we all have to go through the realization that we as professionals need to develop telehealth skills, even if it's not our preferred method. We need to ensure that we have the capacity to provide those, because ultimately our job is to provide services to students, and we need to be flexible and be able to do that for our students, which takes some work. But that also means, again, what are those procedures going to look like? What are those platforms going to look like? Am I trained to utilize those appropriately? Another problem we've seen occasionally across the nation is that in one of those situations where a professional was doing a suicide risk assessment, all of a sudden they don't have access to those special education records, to those attendance and discipline records, nor do they have access to the supports that they used to have sitting with them in their office. And so ensuring that we have mechanisms that the people that need the information, who would be working with these students, have access to that. And all of this means too that we would need to pass that by our legal counsel and make sure that they put their blessing on these new policies and procedures, because we are compelled to protect kids in schools. That's our job, is to protect kids first, but we also have an obligation to protect ourselves professionally in our schools. And so having procedures is the best way to ensure that. Okay, this next set, the next checklist, remember, for suicide prevention, one focused on prevention and the other checklist looked at intervention in the time of distance learning. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to hit some highlights. But for example, does your app that students might report suicidal ideations for themselves or others, does it have a geolocator? Do we know where students are in distance learning? Because they might not be at home and they're certainly not at school. So just thinking through some of those other things that might be essential as you're trying to provide that virtual risk assessment. Typically, again, we often do assessments in teams. I think that's the best way. And if it's not two people in the room with the student, it's at least a second person outside who's ready to help take action. So we need to plan for that. So what does that look like virtually? How is Trisha going to support me if I'm conducting a risk assessment interview and I determine that I need help? You know, it's no longer that I can give her the secret knock on the door or push the button, and then how do we coordinate that to get to the student and the help that they need? So procedures we need to be thinking through. I just think a lot of it calls for practice. A lot of the things discussed call for, sorry, that's my alarm, call for practice from our crisis team members, allowing our teachers to practice, allowing our students to practice the same way we practice other safety protocols. And that gives us, too, those of us who've been doing this for years, the ability to evaluate our systems and say, is this going to work in the virtual space? What else do we need? So that's just again, touching very briefly on some of the highlights from that document. The next set of items and what is next on your resource list then is a similar thought process of virtual considerations for your behavioral threat assessment teams. So suicide prevention falls under threat assessment, but that would also include other types of threats of harm to others. So students who may be planning to hurt another student or to do large scale damage to a school, all of those things fall under threat assessment. That's another procedure where we need to be mindful of the virtual space. And again, I'm not going to teach you in threat assessment today. I hope that you'll do that. If you need training or you need updated training, I would recommend going to the Office of Safety and Security, again, at the State Department of Education. They have training for you. It's free, it's good, and it will help you in knowing the appropriate ways to conduct threat assessment, knowing, again, that the ultimate goal of threat assessment isn't just to determine if a student has a credible threat. That's part of it. That's only helpful if then we provide resources and supports to students. So it doesn't end with the assessment, yes or no, that's a credible threat. That's just where it begins so that we can then provide supports to students. So I'd like for you to look at that document that I provided from Dr. Reeves and Dr. Christina Conley about this. That's their bread and butter. And again, they've been updating as research comes in for virtual spaces, this threat assessment piece. And so I'm going to skip through these quickly, but you'll see on the document, it talks about your process. So your threat, a behavior threat and management process. An example is, guns aren't okay at school, but guns are permissible at home. How does that change our policy? How does that change our procedure? We used to know one thing and we knew what to do when we saw a gun, right, on campus, but now we have to rethink that given our home considerations, for example. I'm just seeing if I can hit the highlights because I'm running out of time. Also, considerations for those behavioral threat assessment behaviors. Again, it's similar to a suicide threat assessment. They overlap a bit, but it has some unique features. For example, now we might need to be more proactive in scanning social media posts and figuring out where kids are online and what they're doing. I said I was going to mention cyberbullying. We need to have threat assessment procedures followed with interventions to address cyberbullying. And just thinking about different contexts. An interesting finding is that I think we all suspected, and you didn't have to tell a room full of mental health folks, that people who had previous mental health concerns we would need to have them on our radar as having potential reactions to distance learning and to the pandemic and to racism and all of those things. We knew that. An interesting finding, though, is that students who might have never been on our radar had we stayed in person and not had the pandemic are now potentially the students who are showing the most depression, anxiety, and substance use. And it makes sense because it's like the students that were most connected to school are now the ones suffering the most that they don't have those same types of connections. So just an interesting consideration to think about students, again, who in a traditional format may have never been on our radar, we need to be thinking about. So again, this document, I feel like I'm leaving you with a lot of things to think about. It leaves you with some process as well. Like, here's the process and how you could update it to account for some of these virtual considerations. So read that document, that checklist, and it will be helpful as you're managing your threat assessment processes, not just for those posing the threat, but as this slide suggests, also those who are victims or who are in fear of a threat of some type. Okay, I'm running out of time, and I knew I would, but I'm running even shorter than I thought I would. The last section I want to highlight to you as my fellow mental health folks is really just this notion about mandatory reporting, and that's a third area of safety that we need to update, rethink, and retrain in for the virtual space. And I do give, I've given a couple of districts some one was a half day and one was 2 hours training on this. So this is something, again, I'm not leaving you without resource to do the work further. And I talk through mandatory reporting as a whole, as well as what teachers and others should be looking for in the virtual space, how to report, and those types of things. And the reason, of course, that this is so critical and why I'm asking you to partner with me in improving our school processes and in talking to your staff is because what the research has shown us is as much as a 50% decrease in reports to child protective agencies. So yay, not yay, because it's not that the abuse or the neglect has lessened, and in some cases it may have increased, because emergency room doctors, on the other hand, report seeing more and more cases of severe child abuse. So the problem is we're not sharing physical spaces with students. Teachers who are primary reporters of abuse don't have experience knowing what to look for in virtual space. In fact, most research shows they underreported to begin with. So we need to, as champions of this work, and I know you're often leading the helm of the mandatory reporting work in your buildings, we need to be mindful of teaching our teachers how do we do that virtually, and again, giving them agency and capacity to know they can report. Always err on the side of the child. If they're wrong, if there's no evidence, if it doesn't turn out, that's better than being right and not having said anything. So again, I do have some materials I'd be happy to either provide or to share with you to provide some of these supports for what does abuse and neglect look like in the virtual space, and again, some ideas about reporting that. So as I close out today, and I know I just flew through some of this, I just want you to consider that we have a job ahead in terms of our skills and competencies, and that even those of us who've been doing this for a long time have some work to do to make sure that we're helpful in creating safe spaces virtually in the same way we're so dedicated to creating safe space physically. And that there's certain procedures specifically like suicide risk assessment or behavioral threat assessment that really need and deserve our attention moving forward, because they need to be updated. And that includes updated training, updated partnerships with community members, and just kind of a reconfiguration or adaptations to our best practices work. The second last bullet there is also that, hey, while we're doing these updates and while we're thinking through these procedures that are tried and true that we've used for a long time or that we're comfortable with, let's develop it through a lens of virtual safety, but also equity. It would also be a good time to address equity in some of those procedures. So I'm speaking specifically to, does our behavioral threat assessment lead to discipline and further behavior, or does it lead to restorative practices, for example? And also NASP always emphasizes this in their materials and their trainings, and I love that we need to emphasize also caring for ourselves, and that we need to be mindful of this is hard work and it's a mountain ahead of us. So how are we supporting ourselves as the caregivers? How are we supporting our team members? And how are we supporting staff that we're asking to engage with us in this work? So I hope some of these resources will help guide your efforts in some of the compelling discussion we've had today. And I hope you just give yourself and your team some grace and some time to grow. It's not going to happen overnight, but I do think it's some important work ahead and some exciting work to really make sure we're meeting the needs of all students. And to close, I will just remind you that the State Department does have a crisis team. This is the QR code. If you scan that, that will take you to our website. The number in red is our crisis number that's monitored 24 hours a day if your school is experiencing crisis or needs support. I would ask you to consider watching the pre-recorded session called Are You Prepared? And that's part of the conference. That's going to tell you a lot about our crisis team. So we do provide professional development and training in a number of areas, including those we discussed today, including comprehensive crisis management, And we also provide direct response and crisis support services. So the rest of your slides are there for your reference so you can read about what we do. I actually didn't plan on going through that today, but wanted you to have that material. And again, that pre-recorded session will help. But Tricia and I are happy to help engage in this work, answer questions, provide resources, and do all we can. So I'm probably right out of time, it looks like. Please email me if you have questions. I will also have Tricia save the chats from the box. And if we need to do some follow-up work with participants with some of those questions, we can. But I just want to end with gratitude for attending and listening to my speedy session today, and especially gratitude for supporting our students and education. So thank you as a mom and as a fellow educator. It's just so refreshing to know that you're out there doing the work that you're doing, and you are seen and you are appreciated. So I'll hang on a few minutes in case anyone has any burning questions before they move to the next session. And otherwise, I just wish you a great day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. So thank you. Tricia, was there anything super specific that I can be mindful to address if anyone wants to stay past time?
There was only one question, and that was just were the slides provided in the documents tab, which I was able to find that. So the slides are in the documents tab, but if you cannot access them, I have provided Dr. Olinger's email in the chat box, and you may email her and she could provide them to you as well.
Yes, and I also included in the documents section our call card for the crisis team, if you want to print that or have that electronically, as well as links to the resources I mentioned today in the presentation. Great. So no other questions?
There were no other questions.
Okay. Well, then I think we'll end the meeting, and thank you all so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the conference, and please remember to complete the session feedback form on the Whova app. Thank you.